So people are still joining, but let's start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the series EBFM from Paradigm to Practice. I'm Gonçalo Carvalho from Portuguese Marine Conservation NGO Siena. We've been working in fisheries in the Northeast Atlantic for over 10 years. And recently, in recent years, we've dedicated quite a bit on how to move fisheries in the region towards ecosystem-based fisheries management. So in the context of that work, we decided to do a webinar series on this topic, inviting experts to present the latest science. But also to talk a bit about the interface between science and policy. And hopefully this webinar series will contribute to understand a bit better how we can move EBFM from paradigm to practice. So in the second webinar, we have Jessica Tengval. Thank you so much, Jessica, for being with us. Jessica is from the University of Bergen in Norway. And she's about to complete her PhD on natural mortality in fisheries management. We invited Jessica because we are very interested in her research about predator-prey interactions and also fishing closures. And also we really wanted to have speakers from different coastal states and not only our usual crowd, which is more focused on the EU, because indeed, when we're talking about the Northeast Atlantic, is important to bring different coastal states to the mix. So before I give the floor to Jessica, just a few housekeeping rules. We are conducting this meeting in webinar format, exclusively in English. And so this means that only Jessica and I will have the floor and video and the possibility to speak for those attending. And thank you very much for being here. You can put your questions, submit your questions and comments in the Q&A function that you would have access in your Zoom. And then I'll read the questions out to Jessica after she finishes her presentation, and hopefully she can respond to all of them during our session. We are scheduled for an hour, but let's see how we go. If the conversation is really going, we can extend it a little bit. But having said that, I'll give you the floor, Jessica. Thank you again for accepting our invitation, and please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gonçalo. Thank you for inviting me. I am very happy to speak about this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. So, yeah, ecosystem-based fisheries management. I've kind of gone with the title that is sort of the same as was stated, from paradigm to practice, from utopia to reality. And I'll focus on giving some examples that hopefully will show you how we can get closer to EBFM in reality. And the examples that I'll show, they're all based from Norway. Yeah, on how we can include some ecosystem thinking. But first, let's start with why do we even need to consider ecosystems? And probably most of you know, but ecosystems, they affect fisheries. For example, you can have target species being directly impacted by temperatures and such. But fisheries also impact ecosystems. So it's quite holistic thinking that all of this, what comes around goes around, I guess. And that's why we need to think about ecosystems when we do fisheries management. But the thing is that traditional fisheries management, such as stock assessments, reference points, or harvest control rules, they mainly focus on single species to maximize catch. So often ecosystems are not considered, and there's no links drawn to this in a lot of fisheries management. So I'll give you some examples of how we can get closer to EBFM as a reality. And the objective of EBFM is to sustain healthy marine existence and the fisheries they support. So let's dive into how can we do that. The first example I'll show is based on trophic interactions, such as predator and prey relationships. So in northern Norway, I hope you can see it here now. I'll minimize this so you can easily see. In northern Norway, there's a lot of fjords in Norway, but this study focused on some fjords up in northern Norway. And that was because there's two fjords that have not been trawled for shrimp since the 1970s. And that obviously creates a really unique framework to investigate the impacts of trawling on predator-prey relationships and even just on densities of species. So this study was focused on northern shrimp and Atlantic cod. And since there hadn't been any fishing for over 50 years, it had this uniqueness to it. The thing was that, or the study was kind of encouraged by the Norwegian government, wanted to then get an overview of the area to know if it's feasible to actually reopen these untrawled areas or untrawled fjords called Porsanger and Tana here. So from having been asked, the Institute of Marine Research was asked by the Norwegian government, can you map out these areas to investigate how it looks and how it compares to a trawled area? So in this study, we looked at, we compared to the fjord Kvænangen, where fisheries is still occurring. That little boat is supposed to indicate that. So fishing has been ongoing there, or trawled fisheries has been ongoing there for shrimp continuously. And there are other fishing forms occurring in Porsanger and Tana, but trawling for shrimp has been banned since the 1970s. And the ban occurred because of, but there was a lot of bycatch of different fish species, particularly cod. And it was bycatch of a lot of undersized cod, that was caught. And they were already, cod was already quite heavily impacted by fishing, so it was best to limit the impact, and so the trawling was banned. But the question is then, how will this reopening of this trawling fishery impact the system, and particularly then the trophic interactions? So the main survey that was done was in 2018 and 2019 in spring and autumn, where a lot of service or some service was conducted across the areas, and all the dots here, the blue and the yellow and dark blue here, they indicate all the sampling or where the trawl were sampled. And this is then from all of the samples, there was stomach data collected from all of these areas and across various species. But today we'll focus on the cod case. So we really compared these different areas between where no trawling has occurred and where trawling has occurred. So to first just look at what then, we just started to just look at what does trawling impact the densities on shrimp and cod. So this is now looking at them individually. And what we could see was that when we look up here at shrimp across the area, the three fjords, with the red box indicating where trawling is not occurring, and where the blue box indicates where trawling is occurring. And we can see that the more yellow color it becomes, the higher density there is of shrimp. And we can see that across these fjords, there is actually quite a high density of shrimp across all of these fjords, independently of there being trawling occurring or not. There's some spots in Kvænangen that looks where trawling is occurring that maybe looks to be more shrimp comparatively to the other fjords, but it's quite evenly distributed. Similarly, if we look at cod here on the bright side, we look at cod density, and we see that it's a little bit hard to see here because there is no like as hotspotty places as there was for shrimp, but we can see that the density of cod is even distributed. We can see there's some local hotspots where there's a little bit more grayer areas. So all the brighter colors, they show more higher cod density. So quite even distributed. There are some spots maybe in Kvænangen that seem to indicate a higher cod density in comparison to particularly Porsanger, where trawling is not occurring. So that really meant that for us that trawling wasn't necessarily impacting the densities. But then we wanted to look at what would the implications be if on predator-prey interactions if shrimp trawling is to be reopened. So based on the stomach data that was collected and geostatistical modeling, we could then extrapolate across the fjords to investigate the probability of shrimp being in cod stomachs. So this shows now, again, the red box here shows where trawling is not occurring. And you can ignore the little box here for now. I'll explain what that is in a bit. But the big map here shows the stomach data from 2018 to 2019. And we can really see that there is a high probability of shrimp in cod stomachs in percentage, in particularly Porsanger. So again, the brighter spots indicate that there are some hotspots where we can see that there are quite a lot of shrimp or there's a high likelihood for shrimp being in cod stomachs. This would then compare to an older collection of collection of stomach data from 2009 and 2010, where we could see that it's actually even a higher probability of shrimp in cod stomachs. And that indicated to us that even across time, there is actually quite a high probability of shrimp eating shrimp being eaten by cod. So we see some variation across the different fjords, that there is a spatial difference between the fjords, and we also see within fjords, we see a spatial differentiation in the cod consumption of shrimp. And then so there's really that give us the impression that cod was definitely eating more shrimp in Porsanger than in the other fjords, particularly. So we could see that the Porsanger cod, they eat more shrimp than the neighboring cod. And if we look at these plots shown here, where we compare the different fjords, so Kvænangen being where trawling is occurring, and then we see Porsanger from 2008 and 2019, comparison to 2009, we see that cod biomass was higher in 2009, and shrimp biomass was also higher in 2009. And we can see that consumption biomass which is indicating that cod was eating quite a lot of shrimp in 2009 was also quite high. So we can see, again, comparing, this is not to say that this is how it is all the years, so continuously over time. This is just a snapshot that indicates to us that, okay, we can see that cod does indeed eat shrimp throughout time, it looks like. And this is all in biomass in tons, and we can see that the blue boxes is where you want to be focusing now. We can see that there is a slight occurrence of cod eating more shrimp in Porsanger in general, also over time. And then looking at the consumption ratio, which can be seen either per unit of shrimp biomass and per unit of cod biomass, we also see that consumption ratio is higher in Porsanger. So this really showed to us that there's spatial variation in predation pressure across these fjords, and that we also saw it within the fjords. So the thing that was maybe a bit surprising, one would have thought that maybe trawling would change these patterns a bit. But shrimp, what worries us is that shrimp fishing can then mean that shrimp mortality might increase, and that might also mean that there's less food for cod. So introducing a trawl fishing for shrimp can increase shrimp mortality, adding to already a higher predation pressure in Porsanger particularly. Shrimp fishing might therefore be impacting cod both directly through bycatch, which was already seen previously, but also through limiting the food resource in an area where it seems like cod actually prefers to eat shrimp. And so this limited food availability for cod might occur, and that can then in turn impact the cod stock and fishing. So what is the objective? Is the objective then to preserve cod, or do we want to fish shrimp? And maybe these two do not need to be mutually exclusive, but can be considered together. And from this study, I think that it shows that diet data can provide insight into important predator-prey relationships that can be important for mapping out how fisheries might impact such interactions, which in turn impacts fisheries. Diet data can also serve as an indication of prey abundance or predation mortality in space and over time, which we saw here. There were spatial differences in predation pressure. And it can be worth considering predation consumption in stock assessments, as we can see here, such as including predation mortality. So spatial stock assessments or even just local quotas can and should maybe be considered in heterogeneous fjord ecosystems such as this, or even in coral reef ecosystems that are also quite heterogeneous. So ignoring spatial temporal patterns and varying predation pressures may lead to inaccurate perceptions of stock productivity. And so therefore, it is important to consider spatial dynamics of predators when assessing prey species, as well as implementing spatial regulations, because this can contribute to rebuilding not only local fish stocks, such as the cod in this case, but that is the predator, but it can also avoid increased mortality on the shrimp that can cause the prey stock to decline if also introducing the fishing. So that's something that needed to be considered when giving this advice. And so in this case, the advice that was given was that for now, trialing a trawling in the outer region of Porsanger was the advice for now. And so we'll see how that goes, and I guess in the future. But also, so this study kind of showed how predation pressure as a part of traditional fisheries management could take us a step forward to EBFM. And so I want to highlight a case in Norway where I think EBFM is being done directly in fisheries management. And that is in a cod capelin case, which is predation included in stock assessment. So this is in the capelin assessment, predation by cod is a part of the total mortality. And so this is occurring in the Barents Sea in northern Norway, where capelin is heavily predated on by cod. And so when you manage the capelin, they consider how much is going to go to, how much you expect to go to cod consumption based on diet data, and how much can then go to fisheries. And that means that in years where there are many capelin, there can be both enough food for cod consumption, but also for fishing. But when the capelin stock is small, it means that fishing can be banned to ensure food for cod. So that's an example of where such as diet data goes into a stock assessment usage, and I think that shows a step towards EBFM. Another example that I will just touch on, but I think Jacob Bentley might cover this more, so I'll only mention it briefly, but it's something that I'm also currently working on. And it's using Management Strategy Evaluation Framework, or the MSC, to try and think about how ecosystem-based scenarios can be a part of MSC to evaluate harvest control rules. So this framework allows for simulating alternative population scenarios that can then be impacted by fishing, and that is kind of creating a population model that is the operating model that we see here on the left side. And then we have the management strategy can then be performed setting a harvest control rule that is based on the level of the stock spawning biomass, so a fishing rate can then be determined. And that's the management strategy evaluation, or the management strategy on the right-hand side. This is a shortcut MSC, so it's not explicitly using a stock assessment. But the framework is really great for testing either inclusion of environmental conditions or even building on available mechanisms. So there is a study done by Duncan Skagen from Norway, where he included, and others, they included temperature as environmental conditions and created alternative population scenarios to determine the performance of a harvest control rule. And this is all performed for Norwegian spring spawning herring. And also, John Trocta is currently working on species interactions as a part of alternative population scenarios in this framework, where he's looking at how overlaps between Norwegian spring spawning herring, mackerel, and blue whiting might impact each other, that can then impact how we set our harvest control rules. And then in my own work, I'm looking at available mechanisms. So I'll try and give some examples of what I mean by that. My work focuses on natural mortality, as Gonzalo mentioned. So there's a bit of research showing that natural mortality varies and changes over time, but usually it's kept as a constant in most management. So I have taken, or I'm taking other people's studies that shows that natural mortality changes because of disease events or predation. Some assume that, natural mortality might be increasing as a trend over time due to temperatures or different variations in nature. There's also some studies that claim that density dependence might impact natural mortality, such that when you have high densities in a population, natural mortality might increase. And this is all impacting stock productivity and should be considered when you try and implement a harvest control rule. So this is not including explicitly ecosystem and an ecosystem link, but it's using available mechanisms to then create scenarios that can then be implemented in an MSC framework to then try and have ecosystem-based evaluation of harvest controls. So that's something that I'm currently working on. And that's really then trying to bring in, I think MSC is a good tool for either implementing ecosystem conditions directly, or creating scenarios that we can then base our harvest control rules on, or at least test them, the performance of them. And I think then that is a good tool to use for stakeholders that I think Jacob will talk more about tomorrow. But I also think it's important to think about, when is fisheries management actually ecosystem based? And this is an illustration that shows 3 blind men trying to touch an elephant and trying to figure out what an elephant actually is. And I think I'm adding this in because I think different people see things differently. And I acknowledge that some of the examples that I show might not be the holistic view of including ecosystems. But so I guess the question is it enough to include predation pressure in the stock assessment? Or is it enough to have ecosystem scenarios in an MSC framework? But I do think, it's worth considering, when is fisheries management ecosystem based? And so I think still these examples can show how we can go from a kind of utopic, holistic thinking to reality. We do need to give advice, And we can actually create a link between traditional fisheries management and ecosystems through using diet data and to map out trophic interactions that can then be included to give advice on. I also think that creating ecosystem scenarios in the MSC framework is a good way forward. And especially having these kind of simple ecosystem links can maybe be sufficient to achieve the fisheries objectives. And I thought it was really interesting that someone mentioned yesterday how a convenient excuse for not doing EBFM is due to data limitations. And I do think that's a valid excuse in many cases. All the cases I've shown you here with diet data and building MSCs are on stocks that are data rich, and there's a lot of money being put into these stocks. So I do think that data limitations are real issues, and these models are, even though I say that these are simple inclusions, they are still complex and time consuming. And so I'm unsure how feasible it is to achieve for all stocks worldwide, for example. And I think in saying that MSCs are a good framework, and the building an MSC on alternative mechanisms and not directly including maybe ecosystems can be a way forward to include ecosystem-based management, if we think that is enough. And that was all for me. Thank you for your attention. I hope that was clear enough on some examples of including or how we can achieve EBFM.
Thank you, Jessica. It was very clear. And indeed, I think coming from yesterday's webinar, where it was, Marie-Julie did give some concrete examples, but it was a lot about building a framework. I think your presentation today really gave us some objective things that are happening that I think try to start in a way of going to EBFM, which I think is fair enough. I said it yesterday. It's not an easy task.
Yeah.
I think the question you raise, if this will be applicable everywhere, to every fishery, to every stock, is a valid one. And so, yeah, I think it was a very nice continuation from yesterday, and I did recognize that you attended yesterday's
Yes.
webinar, so it was great that you made the link. So people are still not writing stuff. Oh, here comes the first one. I do have something, but I can save mine for later. So we have our first question from another speaker. This is good because we're getting this interaction that you suggested, actually, Jessica, through the chat between speakers. We haven't excluded that possibility. We might try to organize a roundtable with all the speakers in a later date. But in the meantime, speakers are interacting, which is great. So we have Dan Stedman from Pew will be our last presenter next week. And Dan says, great talk, Jessica, and really like the key message around not getting hung up on perfect EBFM. On including ecosystem scenarios in MSC frameworks, do you think the manager decision maker community has woken up to this idea as a route towards practical EBFM implementation? If not, do we need to better explain to managers that this is something they should be proactively asking their scientists to do? So 2 questions. And
I can only speak from the Norwegian framework, but I think that from what I see and from our collaborators at the Institute of Marine Research in Norway, that EBFM or connecting EBFM with MSC framework is happening. So I think this year they're doing an MSC on capelin, where they're including obviously the cod predation as a chart, and now actually there hasn't been an MSC before for capelinds that's been built this year. So that will include the predation from cod. And I know that the herring, I think they're scheduling a herring benchmark. Maybe someone on this call can correct me.
Yes,
Yeah, where they are also expecting to use an MSC. And I think John Troctor's work on having these overlapping species and how mackerel might impact the distribution, particularly of a herring, is going to be a part of it. But so I think I see it in Norway that it's happening more and more. It's a process and it takes time. But I think that politicians or stakeholders should ask for it more, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks. So please feel free to add a few more questions, everyone. I do have a bit of a general one. So sitting through yesterday's presentation from Marie-Julie, I imagine you were reconsidering your work around it. So my question is, what were you thinking? Like thinking about your work and your PhD, possibly getting a bit anxious about about defending it next week, or
Yes.
what were your thoughts? Like how did the two things connect?
Yeah, I think the wind farm perspective, obviously it's different in comparison to purely setting quotas. And I think my work is very focused on how can we set quotas that are based on ecosystems. Whereas the whole wind farming perspective is you're thinking about, can we have wind farms and fishing, and how will all the stakeholders agree or disagree, and how can we manage the different agendas. So there's not a direct link as such, and maybe that's okay, and that's maybe also what I'm trying to get at with when is it EBFM, and should we always have this super holistic or utopian view of including everything in an EBFM, or will it actually just become too tricky because we all have different objectives that we want to reach? I don't know. I think it's possible, but I also often struggle with understanding when I see talks about how people run EcoPath or Atlantis models, I think it's hard to understand exactly what was done and with what objective. And I can only imagine then including stakeholders is going to make it even more complicated. I have never done it, so I don't have experience myself with it. So I can't really comment on that. Yeah.
But if I was, and of course we did evaluate some of your work, and I honestly only saw the windmill scheme, the wind farm really scheme yesterday. But what I was thinking through Marie-Julie's presentation is that indeed what you're doing contributes to the management and it's to the ecosystem, to the environmental windmill. I don't know if you think that is a way to interpret it.
Yeah, no, I can completely agree to that. That it does link, and I think for sure in Norway it's I think that's under debate how many wind farms we should have offshore and where they should be, and that obviously links hugely to this. That just because you have banned fishing in one area doesn't mean that you can just have fish farms or have wind farms in there. So it does link, I think, and it's something you need to consider both aspects. I don't know if it's always so easy to have a model that includes it all. I guess the modeling aspect of it is what's going to be the hardest, and then communicating your model outputs. Yeah, I guess that's a whole marine spatial planning subject of how do we plan our oceans.
Yeah. Someone mentioned they use Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which I guess every country has a sort of a version of it. But then yes, how do you get that into fisheries management? And setting is not an easy step. But I also enjoyed what Marie-Julie mentioned yesterday, which is a bit the role of science to push the envelope and to be a bit ahead of the game. And indeed, I think the wind farms are also, at least in the EU, are definitely increasing the urgency of figuring out how do you include some of these other activities in your stock assessments. And I can tell you in the context of the advisory councils, there's a huge conversation about wind parks versus spawning areas. Things like this. So I think indeed it's an evolving agenda, which might become urgent by the minute.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And speaking of advisory councils, and again, we've had very good attendance from the ICES community and the advisory councils community as well from the EU. And thank you for those who are present and also for supporting us in the outreach. We have a question from Tamara Taleska, who's the secretary of the North Sea Advisory Council. And here's her question. Another great presentation with concrete examples. Thanks for that. Where does the impetus come from to go where does the impetus come to go down the EBFM path in Norway? That's the first question. Is it a government incentive, or is there a push from science, environmental groups, or industry? Where are these discussions happening? Are there similar bodies to the EU advisory councils in Norway? Feel free to go far, Jessica, no worries.
I'm actually not entirely sure if it's been driven by government or scientists to go towards EBFM. I mean, the cod capelin case, if we want to call that an ecosystem-based management approach, then I think that one is quite old. And I think that comes from science together with government, because you do want to fish both capelin and cod. But because capelin is such a fluctuating stock, you needed to consider, you needed to incorporate the cod predation on it. I'm not entirely sure if that was government or science-based. I think from what I know, with the Atlantis model and such, I think that's a push from the science community in itself. But I do think that the government is quite good at asking the scientific community for advice on these things. For example, now that they were going to consider reopening these northern fjords in Norway, I think that came from the government to ask, okay, can you please map out this area so we can consider it? So that was a request from the government. So I do think that the government actually does a lot of requests, and I mean, that's good and it's direct. So I think it's a bit of both in Norway. It's both driven from government and the science community. And if there's any other, what was the question at the end? Some groups, if there are.
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't know if you're familiar with those, but in the EU, like the common fisheries policy creates these advisory bodies by regions or areas. There's an aquaculture and a markets one, for example, where, well, their official consultative bodies of the Commission and the Council of the Member States for fisheries, and they include fisheries interests and other interests, including NGOs, but also a variety of organizations. And so the question is, do you have a similar bodies in Norway? And honestly,
I actually don't know, but I would assume so. If I were to, but I mean, the Icelandic community also knows Dorothy Dunkel, but I think Dorothy Dunkel works a lot with including stakeholders in her work, and then kind of how do we include ecosystem thinking alongside what stakeholder agendas are. But I'm not sure if there's any particular forums, not that I'm aware of now. But I'm also not at the Institute of Marine Research, so it may be better to ask someone from the, yeah.
Okay, no, thank you. That's fair enough. You clearly haven't been invited to present there, which is something that should happen. But but yeah, no, I think different. I think the structure that we have of advisory councils is quite interesting. They function in different ways, but it is quite interesting. And over the years, it has generated quite a nice interaction between scientists, managers, and the main stakeholders. And I think very much at the level of providing moments where the scientists come and explain their science and present their science. I think that's a massive contribution. And I think that would be also a question from my side. In your study, did you have a lot of interaction with the industry, both with the cods and the shrimp industry?
So I wasn't invited to attend any of those meetings that there were, but I am, from what I know from the people in charge at Institute of Marine Research, which would be Gudelborg Sørvik and Fabian Zimmermann. Those ones are the ones that actually have had conversations with the government and stakeholders. And I remember in the report that they wrote after having done the survey, the first initial report was that when they talk to fishers, the fishers say that they have more occurrences of shrimp when they trawl. And I mean, that's something that is supported by science studies as well, that when you trawl the bottom, it can release more feed for shrimp. And that's kind of what the fishers were saying. So they had those kind of interactions. But I haven't sadly been a part of those meetings, so I can't really tell you much about it.
It's also work to do next.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting, and of course this can be also a phenomenon of agglomeration, right? The shrimp go there because there's food made available, and not exactly increased biomass because you plow the sea.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a very controversial thing.
Yeah, definitely.
But no, I understand, and I am aware of some studies. So we're approaching the hour as well. Please feel free to add comments or questions, people, because otherwise I'm curious to know what you have, what you're working on, Jessica, especially in this input to the possible input to the MSc process. If you can speak a bit about that, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, so as currently I've been working on doing different scenarios of varying natural mortality and including that in MC. So it's not explicitly using ecosystem, an ecosystem link, but it is based on those ecosystem scenarios. So that's what I'm currently focusing on, is how does a harvest control rule perform, or how sensitive is it when we actually have a change in natural mortality? And in that, I'm also thinking a bit about the precautionary reference point B lim, and how that is, should it be an absolute B lim that we have for our stocks, or should it be a relative one? And that I'm targeting beetling because that's what we use to evaluate if our harvest control rule is performing as we want it to. And I don't have an answer on that, what I think is best yet, but that's where I'm targeting my research on at the moment. But mainly I'm focusing on my defense next week. So you're muted, Gonzalo.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks for that. No, of course, and I hope this is also a bit of a, not exactly a dry run, but you can also practice your
Yeah,
the
definitely.
Q&A abilities.
Yeah.
Not that people have been very forthcoming, but fair enough. Your presentation was very clear and very specific, and I do know the Kaplan cod
I
case
think that's quite famous. Yeah.
is very famous. Yeah.
Mm.
I was going to ask you a bit because I know you also have these interests about new uses of the ocean. So I wanted to know, looking and regarding your research or your broader vision of what's going on out there. I wanted to know if you've given considerations to this. How can these other activities, namely related to tourism, um, be at some point brought to the mix? I don't know if you've thought of this, recreational fisheries as well. I don't know if you have any thought to this.
Not directly in my research, but it's definitely something that I'm thinking about, the cultural value of fishing. So where I live in Norway currently, it has a huge cultural value. It's identity to fish. But I don't know how do you put any kind of how do you parameterize that? I don't know. It's obviously something to think about, the human aspects of fishing, and particularly recreational fishing. I know people are working on it. I've seen it, but I haven't approached it myself. I do find it very tough to know how we're going to approach these the human side of things, if you can say so, the cultural values and I guess economics are maybe the easiest way of going about it. If you put economical value on things and model that, that's probably also something a lot of politicians can easily understand. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and indeed, yesterday we touched upon this a bit with Marie-Julie. From my point of view, I've all, besides marine biology, I also have some training in social sciences, and from what I've been following throughout the years, my question is if the data and the continuous data, but also the models, are they ready for social and economical assessments? And I think that's very much being developed. And I do know that in the IC's community, there are a few working groups, and there's a transversal working group that's trying to investigate these things. I think when it comes to immaterial values, I think we're a step back even. And I can tell you that from the NGO community, we are also trying to focus on these immaterial values that the sea provides us, be it related to fishing or otherwise. But I think very much that still is in a bit in the horizon.
Yeah, definitely, I agree.
But it's good also to see that some researchers are looking at these things, or at least thinking at some point these things should be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, I attended the IC's annual conference this year, and I think there's quite a lot of talks about how to think about the human aspect of things, and yeah. how to include economical value and cultural values, and including stakeholders. And I think including stakeholders is probably a step forwards in the right direction to thinking about social aspects.
Indeed. No, good. Thank you, Jessica. I think we're getting closer to the hour. So, oops, wait, we have people are coming through now. Since almost when we're finishing is there when everyone wants to ask questions. No, I'm kidding. But thank you so much. I'm going to start with Josephine Warmoff, who's also with the Pew Charitable Trust. She asks, continuing the direction of bringing EBFM to reality, if you could focus on another research topic besides fishing mortality, what would it be?
Oh, as in, if is this? Oh, she can't specify, I guess. But okay, I guess. So I'm assuming that I interpret the questions as if should it not be, the focus shouldn't be on quotas or not quotas, I guess. But
feel free to clarify if you want. Yeah, so if
but I guess we targeted marine protected areas a bit in the first trawling paper that we did, where we looked at how the trawling might impact densities of the cod and shrimp. And marine protected areas is something that I have explored a bit before, and I think that's an interesting subject to consider, and I can see the value of having marine protected areas. I don't know how much that's obviously conserving an ecosystem. Yeah, I don't know if that was if I understood.
Oh, I think you answered. And then finally, I have another question from Dan Stedman from Pew. Some interesting work being done in Canada around parameterizing cultural values within sea processes to assess trade-offs between, for example, sustainable catches, ecosystem health, and community cohesion. And Dan says it's very different to how we use this tool in the Northeast Atlantic. It seems to be including stakeholders a bit in the direction of what you said, Jessica. In MSCs from the outset, so including stakeholders in MSCs from the outset, and enable diverse types of knowledge objectives to be evaluated, assessed, and therefore ultimately reflected in management. So this seems like something that would be promising, I guess, from what you said before, Jessica. You seem to agree.
Yeah, I do agree.
But indeed, I think just figuring out how to parameterize these other things is challenging, but also, yeah, exactly. I think quite exciting.
Yeah.
So who knows? Maybe in the next few years we have a few new research coming. Well, some new research coming through that allows us to continue to answer these questions. So thanks Dan and Josephine for the questions. Indeed, we're approaching the hour. I want to thank again everyone who's been following us on that side, and of course Jessica for your presentation and availability and insights. I will ask you for some final comments. I'll also take the opportunity to announce the next webinars before you do that. So we have next week, 22nd and the 24th. First, we have Jacob Bentley from Natural England, also very much into the ICES community at this stage. And then, well, trying to make a link between ecosystem and stock assessment, sustainable fisheries management. And then Dan will finish with a bit more of insight into the science policy nexus. They are always happening at 3 o'clock in UK, Portugal, so GMT time, at 4 o'clock Central Europe time, and I'll post the link for the next one for you to register if you haven't. And while I do that, Jessica, I'll thank you again. And indeed, I think step by step is a nice way to go about it, and with some certainty and some specific case studies, some specific examples. I think that will contribute for us to move towards EBFM in a maybe in a slow but steady way.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for your work and being here, and I'll just allow you some final thoughts if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think I've said things that were relevant. Yeah, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to present. It's always good practice.
Oh, thank you very much. So I just posted Jacob's webinars detail on the comments, but you can also find everything in the CNS social media outlets. And yeah, we'll close it for today. Thank you again, Jessica, and best of luck for next week for your
Thank you. Gonzalo.
thesis defense. And looking forward to continue to follow your work and hoping to meeting you again soon. So thank you very much, everyone,
Likewise.
and see you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.